Can you hear me squeaking up here? Or is it just me? Chirip, chirip. So it's called history. When I met the famous Felix Dzerzhinsky, he was a passenger ship and wore a stiff-riveted smile as he rolled gracefully over the eastern Pacific's long, cold swells. His head was square like a stern, while his pigeon-toed feet formed a bow. And his head and his eyes, shaped like anchors, moved up and down on chains. You don't get made into a ship for being a nice man. You don't become a statue in Lubyanka Square without some organized terror. How else to build a reputation, lay the keel. On a ship named for such a person, there might be a man in his 60s, bald, with a limp, dressed in tweeds, accompanied by a younger, much taller, elegant Japanese woman. A man with a name that's hard to forget, who knows ancient Greek and Latin, speaks French, Italian, Spanish, Japanese, his native German, not to mention English in which you converse. What makes him think the ship will never reach port, that he can say the things he says about Russians and Jews? Or that he can get through customs without opening his big leather bag right next to you with its spare limb? A chessboard was painted on Dzerzhinsky's back, sand-weighted pieces as tall as 5 feet and easy to move into position. But the passage was rough through the Strait of Suguru. Rooks, knights, bishops, queens, and kings fell down and rolled on their pedestals like tops, while pawns upright slid around. Who knows the fate of the USSR Felix Dzerzhinsky? Perhaps it's a casino aground on the Aral Sea, or like his socialist realism sculpture toppled by a crane. How bad could he have been? I only knew him as a ship. We parted after crossing Tokyo Bay under a bright sun, although it was night in Yokohama when we arrived. Wharf lights and cranes glared and hovered, and the tugs that accompanied us nudged Dzerzhinsky in place. Between hull and pier, the lap of water was only an expected sound, not a way of listening to the incessant future, shuttling between the present and the past, trapped in a narrow channel, too small for the ship I myself might be. What kind of man travels the world with an extra leg? When we said goodbye, he gave me his calling card. Dr. Otto Karl Schmidt, Waldstrasse 48, D 8000, München 40, telephone 0894-522-063. And a folded piece of paper on which he'd written a request. I've saved the Christmas card he sent in thanks. On the front is a painting by Hugo Kuinisch, Beim Turme von St. Peter. A 19th century scene, 2 young girls, sisters I suppose, stand behind a head-high ironwork rail on a balcony. The older sister wears gloves and holds onto the rail with one hand, standing on half tiptoe looking down. A city snowscape with steep-pitched roofs and 2 church bell towers, above which a flock of almost indistinct crows circles. The younger sister, blonde curls escaping from her winter bonnet, looks into the sky away from the city, or perhaps at a spire that rises behind them. Unlike her sister, she wears a woolen jacket, and as if dizzy from looking up so long, her ungloved left hand grips her sister's jumper. The grip is tight because Kuinisch painted gathers on the fabric. The scene must be so famous, most Germans, especially of a given age, would know exactly what draws the younger girl's attention. Yes, St. Peter's Tower, and the towers across the way, patrolled by crows, the venerable Frauenkirches. Inside, a printed salutation reads, Frohe Weihnachten und gutes Neujahr, followed in a tight, neat hand. Wishes you, dear Michael, your Trans-Sib companion, Otto Karl. And, indeed, you did me an enormous favor by digging up again Krivitsky's Why Stalin Shot His Generals. And I have been fascinated to read it over again 40 years later. Then I had shown it to Ambassador Ott in Tokyo because I thought it was the truth. The German ambassador did not believe in it. Now I know I was right. W. Krivitsky, alias Samuel Ginsburg, a GPU general, sought asylum first in France. Having escaped there 2 attempts on his life, he retreated to Washington, where he was found shot in a hotel on 10th February 1941, 2 years after that article. I would have sent parts 2 and 3 of Krivitsky's article if his Christmas card had not included a Xerox of an excerpt from Hog Island and Other Essays by James J. Martin, a Holocaust denier. Even so, the decent thing to do was carry out his favor. And yet, how hard would it have been for him to track down Krivitsky? The articles ran in the Saturday Evening Post. And Stalin's ruthlessness, he'd already detailed, along with Hitler's opening of the Eastern Front to save Europe from the Bolsheviks. Never mind wolf packs off the coast of the Americas, nor his escape from Dachau, where he was confined after the war. This man, whose motto was Veritas est magna et prevalebit, and spent his retirement defending fascists like Leon de Grelle, and publishing a book, Pearl Harbor, in Neue Sicht. When I met the famous Felix Dzerzhinsky, he was a ship on the cover of an in-tourist brochure, and not the one I sailed on from Siberia to Japan. The ship I sailed, the USSR Baikal, was a lake. And how a lake could be a ship, I don't understand. And I don't understand Michael Collier, then or now, who loves the idea that truth is great. He'll never be a ship or a lake. He'll never have a cable cinched round his neck. Never, never, never pulled head to pedestal to the ground and cut up for scrap. When he traveled the world in 1977, what was he thinking? He wasn't. He was dreaming, like he is now, waking and sleeping, watching himself throw Romanian lei from the window of a train approaching the Russian border. He had more of it than he could account for and was afraid. Before I met the USSR Baikal, I took a train from Bucharest to Moscow, and from there to Nakhodka, Russia's Pacific port for foreigners. In soft class, the car's conductor brought us tea morning and afternoon in glass cups with metal handles, sugar cubes, and sweet crackers. That's all the comfort he'd been trained to give. Otherwise, he hectored us with gestures and disdained anyone who boarded after Moscow. One night, he beckoned me to his compartment. I knew 4 Russian words: thank you, yes, no, and closed. Everything was closed in that vast country, meaning broken. Zakrita is what it sounded like. And that night, after many thimbles of vodka, I learned the word for what it means to embrace the opposite of what you hate. And even in essence, if in essence it's just the same. Hard to show is what I heard as he gave thumbs up to Pinochet, Baby Doc, and Franco. And also nodding to the corridor where the man and his tall companion stood. He repeated a word I didn't understand until he took my pen and drew a swastika on his skin. I'm going to read a new little poem. It's called His Highness's Dog at Kew. It's part of a couplet that Alexander Pope wrote. I'm not going to say what it is because that's what the poem does. His Highness's Dog at Kew. That's who I am. Pampered, well-fed, trampling slack-leashed into the beds, blooming or not, depositing my turds, and sprinkling the tulip stalks, whose buds are like the bud I lick. And though I look like a dust mop, a four-legged mustache, trim my bangs, and as fierce as an Assyrian sight hound, I'll find my way back to Peritas or La Vega Real, snout wet with the gore of human bowel. But for now, a squeaky, annoying yap warns as well as a mastiff's bark. Truth is, I'm weightless in a lap, and on a cold day, I like a cardigan. At night, a stiff brush, all of which sharpens the loneliness I feel. So that's who I am. And now, if you don't mind, tell me, whose dog are you? Uh-oh. This is a poem called Dr. Friendly. Dr. Friendly. He was an example of anti-nominal determinism. Though he was friendly in manner, kindly explaining that my lightheadedness and the cold nausea moving through me probably, most likely, was the Novocaine he'd shot twice into a vein or vessel instead of numbing the surrounding nerves and tissue. And that's why my heart was racing too. But he could try again, though only once more, for that was all the dose a male my weight could handle. Maybe sitting in the chair, blinded by the watery examination lamp and still feeling the heavy weight of the X-ray bib across my chest and abdomen, I didn't have the distance I needed to make a good decision. It was like the time I was thrown out the door of my van on the second or third roll, and landing somehow conscious but not unscathed in the road, my only thought was to sit down right where I was, just for a moment, to collect myself, which is precisely what I was doing when a passerby urged me to get up and go with him to the shoulder of the road. And that's what I did. And that's what Dr. Friendly should have done. Suggested I lie calmly in the chair, take a minute to compose myself, and then reschedule. What idiot, blind, fearful, unnumbed part of me assented to the third injection, I know well. For who can refrain from administering the shock or current, cinching the collar, or denouncing the illiberal rule laid down for the liberal cause? Who can concede to better judgment and be grateful for the stranger who leads you from the road and stays until the cops arrive? Or wave off the final swab of numbing gel that brought me to the brink again beneath Dr. Friendly's masked, hovering face? His name was Fred Friendly. Should have been a sign, right? Have you ever had that when something like Novocaine does not go where it's supposed to? I mean, any normal person would have just got up and walked out, you know? But I thought, well, maybe it'll work this time. This is called Grandmother with Mink Stole, Sky Harbor Airport, Phoenix, Arizona, 1959. It rode on her shoulders, flayed in its purposes of warmth and glamour, its head like a small dog's, and its eyes, more sympathetic than my mother's eyes' kindness, which was vast. 4 paws for good luck, but also tiny sandbags of mortification and ballast, and in the black claws a hint of brooch or clasp. Secured like that, the head could loll, and the teeth in the snout's fixed grin was the clenched, oh shit, of roadkill askew in the gutter. This she wore no matter the weather, and always when she stepped from the plane and paused at the top of the rolling stairs, she fit her hand to her brow against the glare of concrete and desert. Not a white glove soft salute, but a visor that brought us into focus. Mother and father waving first, then oldest to youngest, dressed in our Easter best. We were prodded to greet her. She who gripped the hot, gleaming rail, set her teeth in the mink's stiff grin, and walked through the waterless, smokeless mirage between us. She who wore the pelt, the helmet of blue hair, and came to us mint and camphor-scented, more strange than her unvisited world of trees and seasons, offering us 2 mouths, 2 sets of lips, 2 expressions, the large, averted one we were meant to kiss, and the other, small, pleading, that if we had the choice, we might choose. Let's see. A little coy, but it's not COY, it's KOI. I mean, I think it's important to say that because you don't know, well, maybe it's not important to say it. Coy. Following a path that followed the sloping contour of the land through a break in a wall that seemed built only to hold espaliered vines and trees, trunks corkscrewed near the ground but straightening as they rose, their branches handcuffed, and then beyond a second wall, a third terrace. We found it where the strangers said we would. Larger than a backyard swimming pool, but shallower, filled with murk, a clotted, darkly shaded surface beneath which moved tubular leviathans. Yes, leviathans, bow-headed, orange, gold, red, and black, white-flecked, nudging toward us like a crowd of souls. No one was there to say how much of the pellets to sow, only a neatly printed sign, koi food, with an unnecessary arrow aimed at a plastic bucket with the clear top hard to unsnap that made a starting pistol's crack and sent the koi in a counter-clockwise chum. But it was not until we cast handfuls in careless, strafing arcs that they thrashed and roiled, tails and fins breaching water, white and turbid, a ferocity that ceased as quickly as it began. And though we cast out more, they turned away, lumbering, disinterested, unschooled, moving fluidly, impossibly avoiding contact. And so they came to rest, not without motion, but like an anchored fleet. And then I'll finish with a poem called, another grandmother poem, called An Individual History. And thanks so much for coming. It's a pleasure. An Individual History. This was before the time of lithium and Zoloft, before mood stabilizers and anxiolytics, and almost all the psychotropic drugs, but not before Thorazine, which the suicidal Lachlan called handcuffs for the mind. It was before, during, and after the time of atomic fallout, Auschwitz, the Nakba, DDT. And you could take water cures, find solace in quarantines, participate in shunnings, or stand at Lourdes among the canes and crutches. It was when the march of time kept taking off its boots. Fridays when families prayed the living rosary to neutralize communists with prayer. When electroshock was electrocution, and hammers recognized the purpose of a nail. And so, if you were as crazy as my maternal grandmother was then, you might make the pilgrimage she did through the wards of state and private institutions, and make of your own body a nail for pounding, its head sunk past quagmires, coups d'etat, and disappearances. And in this way find a place in history among the detained and unparoled, an individual like her, though hidden by an epoch of lean notation, marked Parkinsonian tremor, chronic paranoid type, a time when the animal, slowed by its fate, was excited to catch a glimpse of its tail, or feel through her skin the dulled over joy, when for a moment her hands were still. Thank you. I forgot.
We'll bring the mic to you. I know it's horrible and embarrassing to ask the first question, but thank you.
Do people in your poems ever recognize themselves and come speak to you about it? Has this ever happened?
My father went to one poetry reading that I gave. He only went once, not because he was averse to it, but just because I've lived really most of my life on the East Coast, and he was in Arizona. But one time I read at Arizona State, and he came to it. And his response to one of a poem I read was, "It didn't happen like that." I have 4 sisters, and they read my poems. And they're very open. They know that I'm just, making things up a lot of the times. But they also recognize what it's based on. And so sometimes they'll offer suggestions. Oh, do you remember that other thing that happened? That sort of thing. But otherwise, no. Yes.
I was just wondering, in terms of line breaks, I've read some of your poems, but just listening to you read them, Is it mostly to do with rhythmic choices, or more sentence choices, or theme choices? I was just curious.
No, I mean, I think it has to do with a couple things. Some of it is just how the syntax is running across the line, and to create variety in the sentences. Some of it also is following your ear. Excuse me. And then there was a third thing I was going to say, but I've forgotten it. It seemed really clear to me for a while. No, you're paying attention to a lot of things. I mean, my poems are fairly iambic. There's a fairly strong rhythm. Sometimes I'll break against that at the end of a line. Yeah, but I'm always listening to my ear. I really like that notion, Eliot's notion of the auditory imagination. I think about that all the time, mainly because in relationship to what brought me to poetry, it really had to do with just being attracted to the sound of language and having very little to do with what was being said. You know, it was just feeling this visceral connection to it.
You have a couple of poems about Lebanon in here. I wonder if you can explain how they feature in the book against all these other poems that are kind of about more personal or more portraiture or something like that.
Well, you know, you write out of your life constantly, and I made a trip to Lebanon, and in fact, Tom and I were there together. Although this was. Tom wasn't with me. I wasn't with the group of writers. I had gone over ahead, and through a friend, I met some Lebanese beekeepers. And this was in 2007, so it was a year after the August 2006 war, and this was in southern Lebanon. This was just 20, 30 kilometers from the border, and this one guy had lost. A couple hundred hives. They had been, blown up, and it was just spending an evening with him and talking about bees. I'm an amateur beekeeper, and so the poem. So Donna and Catherine are here going like this, because I'm starting to talk about the bees. And so this is what my wife does all the time when we're at a dinner party and someone finds out I'm an amateur beekeeper and they start asking me questions about bees, and my wife goes like this, because once you start, there's no end to it. People are really fascinated about bees. Anyways, I met these beekeepers, and the poem came out of What's that?
We have time for one more question.
I want to know about bees.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask how you arrive at endings. It seems like your poems usually kind of blossom in a different direction at the end, and I'm wondering how that comes about.
Well, I think your description of how maybe some of the poems work at the end is one of the things that an ending can do. It opens up rather than shuts down, and that's a way of keeping the poem going in your imagination. It doesn't end it. I mean, I find sometimes that I have to work against shutting it down. And we were talking about, Catherine asked me a little bit about strategies that you use when you find you're doing something that you don't want to do. And I think that's probably endings. I have this more of a tendency to want to close the poems off at the end. And so I try and find ways in which they stay open. And one of the ways to do that is with an image. Right? Another way to do it is to move into negative, and counter something you've said up in the poem. Ask a question. Yeah, but you want to try and leave it open.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.